A blood-red prairie sunset drowns the horizon. The wind lashes through skeletal cottonwoods, bending them like gallows poles. A broken wagon lies split on the riverbank, its canvas shredded as vultures circle above, black silhouettes scissoring the sky. In the dry creek bed, quicksand gurgles, swallowing a saddlebag whole, as if the earth itself were hungry. Evelyn Harrow, a 19-year-old frontier bride, is being dragged to a forced marriage with an aging outlaw who claims her family's land. Her father is dead, her brother betrayed her for coin, and the preacher himself is bought. She carries the silent fear of a secret. She is already with child, though not by the man who demands her hand. Alone, abandoned, she is hours from losing not only her freedom, but her soul. But the rider who appeared at dusk was no savior. The coroner's inquest recorded her name only once, and then struck it through in black ink. What happened in the hours that followed is why that erasure still haunts the ledger. The grave was still fresh, the mound of dirt not yet settled, when Matthew Harrow haggled with Silas Boone under a sky the color of raw iron. The wood cross that marked their father's place tilted in the wind, as if it could not stand to watch what his children were doing. Evelyn stood with her hands clenched on the hem of her dress, the seams gritty with dust, while Matthew stared at his boots, and Boone talked around a cheroot that kept going out. "Deed's worthless unless the girl's tied to it," Boone said, flicking ash that never really fell, the ember dying before it touched the ground. "Law likes a family. We make it a family." He smiled with the hangdog cheer of a man who had put his gun away only because there were witnesses. The vultures made slow coins in the sky above the cottonwoods. Each coin was a circling promise. Reverend Pike stood near the wagon with his hat twisting in his hands. He wore the thin look of a man who had given away too many breakfasts and had none left for himself. He had come to say prayers over the father, but Boone had stayed his wagon and said there was another service needed, and it would bring more money than a graveside psalm. "It's not proper," Pike said, his mouth dry, his eyes on the widow's plank box. Boone glanced sideways at him, and the Reverend's courage sank like a bucket dropped down a dry well. "You'll write it in your register," Boone said, "proper as anything." He smiled again, and the Reverend turned his hat to hide his hands shaking. Evelyn's father had never been a hard man, and not a rich one. He had a deed to land that touched water, which in a dry year might be a better friend than a sheriff. He had a sick cough that never healed. He had a son he could not bend, and a daughter he leaned on like a cane. He had died in a wind that rattled the rafters and whispered through the chinks, and by the time the wind died down, the outlaws had come riding with their talk of family and law. Boone had ridden at the front, and behind him, men who smelled of sweat and old whiskey and the oil they used on their guns. Evelyn stood by the grave and felt the weight of a secret pressing against her ribs, like a hard coin sewn into a hem. She did not touch her belly. She did not look at the Reverend. She kept her eyes on the split wagon tongue that jutted into the fading light like a broken rib. At the edge of the yard, old Widow Lark watched from the shade of a sagging cottonwood. She had eyes like a hawk's, though one went milky in the evening light, and she had been whispering to anyone who would listen that the winds had taken the voice of the land and turned it back against them. "Storm Bride," she muttered when she saw Boone's men lift Evelyn into the saddle. Storm Bride, the land remembers forced vows." No one listened. She pulled her shawl tighter and spoke to the wind instead. Boone's men led Evelyn away, while Matthew followed at a distance with his shoulders hunched, as if the ground pulled on him with invisible ropes. He had sold his sister to pay for protection he could not earn, believing that one crime canceled another. He had a raw cut on his knuckle where Boone's man Dorsey had made his point with a ring. He had not fought back. He had swallowed blood and nodded. "We'll do it at the Lankford barn," Boone said, pointing downriver where the cottonwoods widened around a fallow pasture. "Lanterns, preacher, a toast. She'll have a husband before the moon climbs." The men laughed. The sound skipped across the river and broke into the dark like stones. When they reached the road that bent toward the barn, Evelyn heard two men behind her speaking as if the night itself were their cloak. Deed runs with the bloodline, one said. Man ties her down, ties the land, the other spat. She's carrying already. Boone'll make it count. The words sank into her like nails tapped into green wood, small blows that did damage because they came one after another. Her secret had not been hers. It had been sniffed out, weighed, and put on a scale like grain. She felt her breath turn shallow and hot in her throat. She saw the Reverend's book in her mind, like a door that would close and lock if a name went into it. She did not know if there was any page that could save her. Matthew brought his horse up alongside her and did not meet her eyes. He put something into her hand without looking, and his fingers were cold as stones. A small knife with a bone handle. The blade rubbed clean too many times and coming up gray. The hilt was sticky with dried blood. It was some other girl's blood from some other fight, but when Evelyn closed her hand around it, her palm knew it all the same. "I'm sorry," Matthew said, barely moving his lips. "I'm sorry." She heard it and did not forgive him. The wind blew dust into her teeth, and she had to swallow to keep from coughing. Somewhere behind them, Widow Lark's murmur returned on the wind, like an echo too late to help. Dusk bent the prairie into long dark stripes when a rider came out of the burn of the sunset. He rode alone, without the hurried press of a posse, or the easy sprawl of men who had nothing to fear. He rode with his back straight and his body quiet, as if his bones remembered something his horse did not. Boone's men slowed by instinct. Hands went to gun belts the way a sleeper's hand goes to his throat when a bad dream settles in. The rider kept coming. He passed them and did not look at anyone but Evelyn. He turned his horse with a pressure of knee and stopped near her stirrup, and Evelyn saw that his eyes were the steady kind, eyes that watched a long time before deciding anything. His hair was braided with strips of red cloth, and his face had the wind-carved stillness of a man who had learned young that showing too much was a form of surrender. He spoke softly, words she did not understand, and touched his chest, and then the horizon, with 2 fingers. Boone lifted his hand. "Keep moving," he said, cheerful again. "We're late already." The rider did not move at first. His gaze rested on Evelyn's face, like a palm pressed to a fevered brow. Then he wheeled his horse and went on ahead, and vanished into the thickening dusk, as if the prairie had opened a door for him and closed it again. They married them in a barn that still smelled of hay and summer, though the rafters were hung with dust and the lanterns cast shadows like bars. The Reverend stood at a table and set his parish register on it, the way a gambler sets down his last coin. He inked his nib and could not make it right. "Speak up," Boone said. "Don't mumble the law." The Reverend swallowed and kept his eyes on the ink while he made his voice steady. "Do you take this woman?" he faltered. Evelyn heard a dry sound, like a cricket trapped in a stovepipe, and realized it was the tremor in the Reverend's throat. Boone said, "I do," with easy certainty, like a man acknowledging a debt that would make him richer. Evelyn kept her eyes on the space just past the Reverend's shoulder, where the lantern's flame made a thin, clear line on the wood. She made her mouth shape words she would not let her heart hear. She said, "I do," to the flame, and not to the man. The Reverend's pen scratched. It sounded like something small trying to escape a trap. When the last amen trailed off, Boone lifted a bottle and made a toast no one would remember. The men drank, and there were cheers, and someone pounded a tune on the side of a feed bin. The tune was cheerful and wrong, like laughter at a wake. Matthew stood near the door and looked down at his boots, and the wet look of shame glazed his eyes. The Reverend wiped his pen and closed his book and slid it into his coat, as if carrying a burden he dared not let anyone else touch. Boone set his bottle down. "Now the deed," he said. He turned to draw it from his coat, and Evelyn felt a coolness move through her like a fish through water. The door was open behind Matthew, and the night beyond was a deep mouth waiting. Out in the dark, the wind had freshened. It carried the wet smell of river mud and the faint hiss of distant sand blowing. A lantern flickered and went down to a wick glow, and a man cursed and shook it. Evelyn moved. She moved like the wind had put a hand to the small of her back and shoved. She slipped past Matthew while he flinched and would not look up. She slid through the door and felt the night catch her like cold water. She heard someone laugh and then stop, and then she heard a chair hit the floor and boots striking wood. She ran for the cottonwoods and did not look behind her, because looking back can take the speed out of a body when speed is all it has. She had the knife in her hand, and she held it close the way a mother holds a child when men are drunk. The ground tilted under her feet where the bank broke away, and she slid down on her hip and caught herself on a root and kept going. A horse snorted in the dark, and Evelyn felt, rather than saw, the rider from the road shift his mount to meet her. He did not reach for her. He only turned his horse to place his shoulder between her and the light that spilled from the barn, and in that small move she felt a gate swing shut and a path open. He said a word she still did not know and tipped his head toward the stand of willows. Evelyn ran there, bent low, the leaves brushing her face like wet fingers. The rider's horse paced her quietly, and when Boone's men came shouting from the barn, the horse eased into the shadows and stood like a stump. They hunted the riverbank with lanterns that made little wells of gold in the dark. Evelyn moved along the water where the mud took each foot and made a sharp sucking sound she could not silence. She stopped when she heard men pass, close enough for her to hear their coats creak. Widow Lark's voice sounded once, far off, a thin thread of song unraveling and then snagging on silence. Evelyn thought absurdly of the wagon inventory her father had kept in pencil, on a scrap of paper, flour, salt, an extra strap for the harness, a whetstone. She could almost see his neat, steady numbers. She wondered if her name would ever be written as steady again. The rider brought her to a willow snag and slid from his horse and touched the ground with his palm, as if asking it permission to hold two shadows where one had been. He spoke and made a gesture with his hand, and she understood to be still. A voice called from not far down the bank, and another answered, and a lantern bobbed like a small planet, breaking and reforming. The rider waited for the lanterns to move away, and then drew his horse along the river's very edge to scrub the tracks. It was a simple trick, and it made Evelyn ache to see it, the way small things can be the difference between being found and never being found again. When the last of Boone's men's voices were only a burr in the wind, the rider touched his chest. "Chaska," he said, and then he touched her shoulder lightly, as if asking for the right to speak her name. She could not find hers at first. "Evelyn," she said finally, and he repeated it once in a way that turned it into something that fit the night. He led her away from the river and up a shallow draw that cut into the prairie like the parting of hair. The wind was colder there. It smelled the way metal smells when a storm is coming, like promise and threat braided tight. Chaska walked beside the horse now, head up, alert to the small sounds the land made when men were moving over it. Somewhere to the east a coyote yipped and was answered. Distantly Boone shouted orders. He did not like losing things. His voice carried a rhythm that had made other men pull triggers for him, and they pulled them now, at shadows and stumps, while Evelyn moved farther away from the barn and the Reverend's thin prayers. The Tipi village lay in a low-bellied valley, tucked into the folds of the hills, where cottonwood smoke drifted soft and thin. It showed no light until they were almost upon it, and then a hidden ember gleamed and fell dark again. The people there knew how to close their eyes when the night was full of watchers. Chaska spoke a word before they entered, a soft sound like a stone set down carefully, and the valley exhaled. Someone hurried from the nearest teepee and laid a palm on Chaska's arm. Voices murmured, questions, a small ripple of concern. Evelyn stood very still with her hand on the horse's neck and waited to find out if this had been a path into shelter or a mistake that would turn and become a trap. A woman with hair the color of a storm cloud's edge beckoned her inside a teepee that smelled of smoke and sage and warm leather. A child's toy, 2 sticks bound with sinew to make a springing hoop, lay by the hearth. Evelyn's knees thought for her and folded, and she sat in the soft light and let her breath catch up. Chaska came in last and spoke low, and the woman answered him with a nod that held respect and sorrow together. The woman pressed a tin cup into Evelyn's hands. The tea tasted of mint and wildness, and it knocked the tightness out of her throat. "Thank you," Evelyn said, because it was all she had to give that any people understood. They told stories by firelight that night, not to entertain, but to remember. Chaska spoke slowly, and the woman translated in a voice that felt like braided grass, flexible, held together by patience. There was a tale of a storm bride, a woman who walked into a camp on the tail of thunder and brought either death or deliverance. She was a warning and a promise. "Land remembers forced vows," the woman repeated in English, and when she said it, Evelyn heard Widow Lark's whisper, hidden inside it, like a second thread in a rope. The story was not about Evelyn, and it was about her. Fear opened her chest like a drawer and tucked the words inside. Out on the prairie, Boone's men hunted. They did not know the land well enough to read the small hieroglyphs it wrote underfoot. Their lanterns told the camp all it needed to know. Sheriff Harlan Boyd took Boone's bribe with the care of a man who believed he was keeping order by arranging the pieces of chaos into lines that he could pretend were roads. He folded the money into his pocket and told himself he had no taste for Boone's shout, but a town had to live with the men who kept it from falling apart, and sometimes those men had coats that smelled of whiskey and gun oil and old horse. He wrote a bounty notice on coarse paper with a blunt pencil. Evelyn Harrow, abductor of peace. He meant to write disturber, then crossed it out and wrote abductor, liking the gravity of it better. He tacked the notice crooked on the post, and the wind made it flap like a loose shutter. Matthew did not sleep. He went to Reverend Pike's small parsonage and pounded on the door. The Reverend let him in and shut the door carefully, as if he were worried a loud click could be a sin. The parish register lay on the table under the lamplight. The Reverend stood over it like a guard who did not trust even his own shadow. "It's done," he said. "What's done can be undone," Matthew said, his voice cracking like a boy's. "Not by me," the Reverend said. He looked at the book and then away, and rubbed the bridge of his nose until the skin burned red. "Men bring their dead to me, and I write their names where the Lord can find them. Today I wrote a living girl's name, and it felt like a burial." He opened the book with hands that shook and looked at the line again. There it was, an ink-dark scar across the page. Evelyn's name, braided with Boone's, tied with the thin loop of his signature. It looked weaker than the thing it claimed to hold. The Reverend's pen hovered, and then lowered, and he drew a line through the entry so thin a man could call it a shadow and not a strike. It was not courage. It was a stutter of doubt. But later, when someone would look for proof, they would find the doubt before they found the words. In the teepee, Evelyn slept in starts, the way a hunted animal sleeps, with one ear open and the body coiled, just enough to become a movement without the mind's permission. She woke to the sound of a small rattle and found a child near the hearth, watching her with round eyes. The child offered her a little leather bag and said a word that the woman repeated, "For luck." When Evelyn took it, her hand brushed the child's wrist and felt the pulse quick and sure. She remembered another pulse, one that beat inside her, steady as a drum too far off to judge distance by. She did not touch her belly. She tucked the bag into her dress and thanked the child and thought, "I will not be buried by a book." Chaska sat at the entrance with his back to the pole, his silhouette like a cutout watched by the stars. He turned his head once, and the firelight picked a thin scar on his cheek. He had the stillness of a man, measuring. When he spoke to the woman later, Evelyn heard something heavy in his voice that had not been there before. The woman's answer was softer than his question. In time, Evelyn would learn the few words that carried the most weight. That night, she learned the shape of grief in a language that did not need hers. Chaska had lost his wife to soldiers who had mistaken their campsite for a hunting party. He had been away, trading, and had returned to ashes, spread carefully by hands that had told themselves they were doing cleanup and not a desecration. The woman who translated looked at Evelyn when she finished and added, Stormbride can carry storms both ways. A drum throbbed once, far out beyond the hills, and Evelyn felt it in her teeth. It was not Lakota. It was the clumsy beat of a man who wanted the night to think there were more hearts in the dark than there were. Boone was gathering men. Chaska's mouth tightened, and he stood, the motion a spring uncoiling quietly. He went to the door and breathed the air, and returned, and knelt by the fire and sprinkled something into it that changed the scent from smoke to green. Tracks, he said, and mimed the way men rid them. He showed her with a stick in the dust how a horse prints when it is asked to hurry, and how it prints when the rider is tired and angry. He showed her how to place her feet in the shadows of cottonwood roots, and how to smooth a scuff with the side of her hand so the light would not find it. He was making her smaller without making her less. Sheriff Boyd, stepping out into the morning to see how his notice sat with the town, found Jonah Pike, the undertaker's son, leaning against the rail with ink on his fingers. Jonah kept a ledger the way his father had, with quiet care and a tolerance for sorrow that only men who straighten the limbs of the newly dead can stomach. "You've got too many in your book this week," the sheriff said, because a joke was easier than a confession. Jonah said nothing. He had seen men with Boone's brand on their hatbands, carried in on doors taken from their own houses. He had written names that had no one to speak them aloud. He had drawn small crosses, one for a child who had lived 2 days, another for a man who had lived too hard and too long. He turned the page now, and the paper made a sound like a flywing. "I'll note who's gone missing," he said. He did not ask permission. Boyd thought for a second of asking for the book, making it official by bringing it under his hand. He did not. At dawn, the valley held its breath. The wind fell back, as if to listen. Evelyn stood with the others, in a long silence that hummed with small sounds. An ember falling, the tiniest shift of fabric, the drumbeat of her own heart, shaped into something she could carry. Chaska spoke to 3 men, each of whom had the patient look of a man who had suffered a lot and learned not to throw his suffering like a rope around other people. He told Evelyn, without words first, then with them, that he would take her to a place where the hills closed around a spring no one could find unless the land itself told them. "You trust?" he asked, and she thought of the Reverend's pen and the sheriff's crooked notice, and Boone's grin and her brother's cold hand passing her the knife. "I trust you," she said, and it was the most dangerous sentence she had spoken since the last one she had said in the barn. They moved before the light warmed. The valley peeled back behind them and closed again, like a mouth that had decided to keep a secret. They climbed a ridge that looked thin enough to slice a foot in two, and on the other side, the land fell away into flats, scattered with river stones the size of skulls. A killdeer called and feigned a broken wing to lead them away from her nest, and the gesture fell into Evelyn's chest like a coin into a cup. She would lead men away from this place if she had to break something in herself to do it. On the ridge behind them, riders appeared one by one, their horses like stains on the light. Dorsey raised a hat and twirled it once, and put it back on, and the gesture was casual enough to be cruel. Another man lifted something and waved it, and a color fluttered in the air. Evelyn's ribbon. She felt the ground tilt and right itself. It could be any ribbon, she told herself. It could be a trick, but you always recognize your own small things. The men laughed, and the laugh traveled oddly in the thin air, coming too soon and too loud, like a man who claps before the music is finished. Chaska saw it too, and did not change his pace. His control steadied her more than any prayer could have. They reached the spring at noon. It came out of the earth through stone, like a thin-throated voice that needed your ear bent close to hear anything it said. The water was cold enough to make teeth ache. They drank in turns. Evelyn splashed her face, and the dust turned into thin trails and ran down her neck. The woman who had given her tea tied a strip of cloth around Evelyn's wrist, a color that would be easy to find in grass if she fell. "Trial," Chaska said, and touched the sun and then his chest. She understood enough to see that this was a test, not of loyalty. She had no way to pledge that, but of steadiness. They took her up another ridge to where the wind worked harder. Chaska pointed to a circle of stones, set long ago. The rocks sunk so deep, the soil had grown around their ankles like thick socks. Here, he said, until we say. It would be a vision quest, if she belonged to them. For her, it was something else, an endurance that would show the women, the men, and Chaska himself that she was not a storm, sent only to shatter. The sky swam with heat, and the light made the world flat as a map. Evelyn stood with the stone pressing its cool against her calves, and breathed the way she had learned to breathe while trying to fish a splinter from her father's palm without making him curse. Slow, careful, in and out, trusting that the next breath would be there. Every small thing became big. A fly landed on her lip and tickled like wheat awns. A hawk cut a slow mark in the sky, and everything below it seemed to wait to see where the shadow would fall. The child from the teepee came and sat out of her sight with a little gourd, and now and then the gourd shook, and that was a kind of company. When her knees trembled, Evelyn thought of the Reverend's pen again, the nib scratching, and she forced herself to think not of the line that had tied her to Boone, but of the thinner line the Reverend had drawn afterward. Doubt laid over certainty, like gauze over a wound. She could live in that thinness if she had to. It would be enough until she could write something thicker herself. When the light shifted its weight and put it somewhere else on the ridge, Chaska nodded, and the women came and took her hands and rubbed them with a paste that smelled of pine and made the ache in her joints ease. Their touch was not ownership. It felt like a lending. Strength passed from one pair of hands to another, with the understanding that it would be repaid when the time came. Whispers ran the ridge like faint rain. Some doubted. They had a right to. Storm brides arrived in stories and left in stories, and in between they did as much harm as good, unless a man like Chaska pinned their tail to the ground and made it behave. He watched the ridgeline while the women tended Evelyn, and his stillness seemed to tell the men who doubted that there would be a reckoning later, and it would be quiet and precise and not to their liking. Down on the flats, Widow Lark leaned on her cane and looked toward the hills, with her head turned like a bird's. She had walked out as far as her joints would let her go, and then farther, because fear can cheat pain for a while. She saw the riders gather again. She counted by instinct and lost count when the dust closed over them like a blanket. "Storm bride," she said again, not sure if she was warning the wind or asking it for mercy. She had an old marriage certificate folded into her pocket, the paper soft with years. The man's name on it had faded. Her own had not. She touched it and believed for one small, foolish moment that a name that lasted could keep another woman alive who was nothing to her but a figure she had seen crossing a yard with a knife hidden in her hand. In town, Reverend Pike took out his register again, unable to bear the weight of not looking. He held the page up to the lamp and saw the faint line he had drawn, and it seemed to move under the light, like a snake that had not decided whether to sleep or strike. He closed the book and slid it under a loose floorboard with a sigh he could not have explained to anyone. He went to his door and stood with his hand on the latch and looked at the sky and seemed to be listening for an answer to a question he had not yet had the right to ask. His wife called his name softly, and he did not answer. He watched the clouds shake themselves into a line that meant wind. He thought of the coroner who would one day ask him to recall details he could not bear to write. He did not know that the inquest would record Evelyn's name once, and then blot it with a stripe of black, so neat it would look like punctuation. Sheriff Boyd visited Jonah Pike's little back room and looked over his shoulder. Jonah's ledger lay open, and neat lines walked down the page, spelling out names with a patience that did not judge. "You keep writing them," Boyd said. "It helps me keep the story straight." Jonah dipped his pen and did not look up. "Stories do what they want," he said. "Books only pretend to keep them pinned." Late that afternoon, a scout slid into camp with dust on his teeth and a look that made the air go cold. He spoke quickly, and Chaska's eyes narrowed, and the muscles in his jaw moved. He turned to Evelyn and gestured to the hills. She stood, and the bones in her knees crackled. He pointed at the ridge rim, and she came and saw them. Boone's riders, a smear of moving dark, far around the valley like a chain. They were not close yet. They did not need to be. Sound carries in a place like that. It carried even the things you did not want to hear. A drum began to beat, wrong, clumsy, timed by a man who did not know how to ask spirits for anything, and did not care that he did not know. It echoed off the hills, and came back doubled and tripled, until it sounded as if the valley itself had a fever. Boone's riders encircled the valley at dawn the next day, just when hope stumbles, because it has been worked too hard through the night. Their lanterns burned pale against the brightening sky, but they kept them anyway, the way a man keeps his pride on him, even when it makes him sweat. They whooped to hear themselves make noise in a place that had not been theirs. They fired shots into the air and let the sound knock against the stone. Evelyn stood with Chaska and the others and felt the old fear that had curled up at the base of her spine spring and scramble. She put her hand over the charm bag at her breastbone and felt its small, ridiculous weight. She had almost died for less. She could live for this. The first horse broke the line and came down toward the valley mouth at a trot that would turn to a gallop if no one said no to it. Dorsey lifted his rifle and let the sun burn on the barrel so everyone would see it, even if they did not want to. Far behind him, Boone sat his horse and raised his arm to signal something that would be ugly and would become uglier if no one braked it. Chaska stepped forward, and the men beside him moved the way a flock moves. When one bird decides the air belongs to it, Evelyn tasted iron on her tongue, like the memory of blood. And then drums answered the clumsy beat from the hills. Their drums, steady, rightful, the echo of many winters and summers stacked one on top of another, until they made a wall you could not climb without cutting your hands. The sound rolled over the valley and back into it, and the way it came back made the clumsy drum up on the ridge sound like a boy smacking a table. The horses pricked their ears, and some of them flicked their heads and refused to move in a way men respect, because it means they are about to eat dirt if they do not. Evelyn looked at Chaska and saw in his face a kind of sorrow and pride, braided tight. The circle tightened anyway. Boone did not like being told no by sound. Men like him needed a thing to push against and break so they could point at the pieces and say they had built something. He lifted his arm higher. His men lowered theirs. The valley seemed to draw itself in, like a breast filling with air before a shout. Evelyn felt the quick gallop of the child in her under her palm, and she thought, live, live, live. She stepped closer to Chaska. He did not look down at her. He did not need to. The air between them filled with the simple understanding of people who had both been stolen from by men who believed paper made theft righteous. The clumsy drum up on the ridge stopped. The proper drums beat. The sun pushed its red rim over the hills and showed the riders' faces and made them look both older and more foolish at once. Boone pointed, and the first line began to move in slow, careful steps, like a man testing a frozen river. Far behind them, on the far ridge, a horn sounded, thin, reedy, a mourner's sound, dressed up as a call to glory. It made the hair on Evelyn's arms lift. She did not know if the horn was theirs or not. She did not think it mattered anymore. The wind changed. It came cold off the west, carrying the smell of a grass fire somewhere too far to help and too close to ignore. Smoke flattened itself along the ground and made low animal shapes. Evelyn's eyes watered. Somewhere behind the riders, someone who did not know the land had lit something he could not put out. It would come later, and it would come hungry. The men on the ridges did not know it yet. The valley did. They moved to meet it all the same. Smoke crept low as a crawling thing, and the riders came on with their hats pulled low and their mouths shut tight, the way men shut their mouths when they have to ride into a place their stomach does not like. Chaska raised his hand, and 3 men moved to block the narrowest part of the valley mouth, where cottonwoods had root-laced a small bluff. Evelyn felt the wind tilt, bringing the fire scent cleaner, and a gloved hand of fear pressed the back of her neck. Dorsey kicked his horse and grinned with his teeth and the horse came down the slope too fast, slipping once, iron scraping stone. Behind him, Boone sat straight, chin lifted, making his men look back now and then for permission to keep breathing. Someone's rifle went off from the ridgeline, nervous, early, foolish, and the crack sped down into the valley and ripped apart the careful quiet Chaska had been shaping. A hawk went up from a cottonwood, like a thrown knife, its cry like a hinge ripping out of a door. Evelyn flinched and then made herself still. She did not want to steal Chaska's steadiness with her shaking. The first rider reached the bottom and found his horse's legs knee-deep in soft sand. He had taken the line that looked flat and safe from above, but hit a seam of dust that gave way. The horse stumbled, went to its knees, scrambled, lather splattering from its bit. Chaska spoke one sharp word, and the man to his left loosed an arrow that bit into the ground between the horse's front feet. The horse lurched sideways and found purchase on a rib of rock and saved itself. Dorsey laughed at the man, and his laugh stank of nerves. Then he turned it into a shout. "Come down and give us the girl, and we'll leave the old women and the children their pots to cook with," he called, jaunty. "She belongs to a man now." Chaska did not answer. He had learned young that words thrown into a canyon bring back only the parts that like you least. They did not charge. They dribbled down in small clumps, feeling for their courage with their heels, and finding only patches of grit. The drums held. The wind held. One outlaw's horse stumbled on the lip of a dry channel and went down, and the rider's leg twisted under him with a wet, heavy sound. He howled, and then bit his own knuckle and rolled like a dog, the knuckle between his teeth bright with blood. Boone did not look at him. He pointed to the far side of the valley mouth, and 3 men took their cue and made for the low break in the bank, where a man could wedge a body through if he didn't mind scraping skin from bone. To do it, Chaska lifted his hand, and a boy no older than 12 put a warning arrow in the dirt at their knees. The men checked. Dorsey's grin faded enough to show the edges of it were painted on. Evelyn's mouth had gone paper dry. She tasted ash and the river's metal breath and the sour left from fear, not fully swallowed. The child from the teepee sat at her heel with the charm bag and the gourd and shook it gently when Evelyn's body shook harder, as if the small sound could sand down the sharp edges. Evelyn thought it almost did. She found herself thinking of her father again, of the way he'd speak to a skittish mare while laying a blanket along her back. Soft, nothing words that meant everything. "Steady now," she heard in his old voice, woven out of smoke and memory. "Steady now, girl." They held the mouth until the light climbed and flattened the colors into hard edges. Boone's men began to creep back up the slope, not admitting retreat so much as repositioning their courage, where it might look more like sense. Sheriff Boyd, still in town, and still telling himself order had a face he recognized, heard the rumors reach his porch by way of men who had ridden halfway out and then thought better of finishing the distance. "Boone's got them bottlenecked," one said. "The Lakota have got him bottlenecked too," another said, grinning in spite of himself. Boyd looked at the sky. The smoke tasted wrong. He thought of drought and dry grass, and how quick a town can go from busy to black. He thought of the money in his pocket, and how it warmed his thigh unpleasantly, and he scowled, as if the heat were the day's fault. Matthew had not chosen a side, and it was killing him. He stood on a hump of land above the barn, with his horse blowing and his hands raw, where he had clung to the reins in lieu of prayer. He saw the dust where Boone's men moved, and he remembered the cold stickiness of the knife when he had pushed it into Evelyn's hand. He saw, too, the Reverend's mouth, thin with shame, when the book closed, and something turned in him, as slow and heavy as a plow at the end of a furrow. He urged his horse toward town first, thinking he could gain the sheriff, and then swerved to the ridge instead, because the ridge gave him more time to make a second bad decision after the first. In the camp, the air shifted and thinned, a sign a storm had not decided yet, whether it would waste itself in thunder or sharpen into something leaner. The women moved the children back among the tipis, where the ground lay flat and where a man rolling wounded would not bowl into them by accident. Evelyn helped carry a pallet, and the old woman with the storm-colored hair chuckled once that she had strength enough to lift at one end. "You look small like a sparrow," she said in slow English, "but you pick a lot with that beak." Evelyn smiled without wanting to. It came like a hiccup. Her belly twinged and settled. Boone's voice slid across the ridge. He was not shouting now. He spoke in that patient, coaxing tone he used on men who had run from worse things and might be coaxed into running again if they felt nobody saw them do it. "No war here," he called. "Just a thief to return to her rightful keeper." The word keeper struck Evelyn like a flat palm between the shoulder blades. Chaska's gaze cut over to her and then away. He took a breath through his nose that made the skin by the bridge flare. "Keeper," he repeated under his breath, not as a translation, but as a private curse. Minutes jerked by. A lizard skittered from one shadow to another and froze. A horse shook itself hard enough to jingle, the metal notes like a handful of dropped coins. The drums slowed and steadied as if to say, "We have all the time a cliff has." Boone's men began to peel away into the grass above. Chaska nodded to two of his men, and they vanished as if the earth made room for them out of respect. The boy with the strong bow took a new position that gave him a narrow angle on the low break in the bank, his bare feet planted, toes gripping dirt like fingers. The old woman's hand touched Evelyn's wrist, light as the weight of a moth. "You stand," she said. "Men watch how women stand." Evelyn stood. It didn't make Boone's circle break. It didn't change the wind, but it changed, very slightly, the angle of Chaska's jaw, and that was enough to anchor her for another handful of breaths. A rider on the ridge lifted something pale and waved it, and another man laughed. It was the bounty notice from town, torn from Boyd's post, flapping like a thin flag. Even at that distance, Evelyn could see the pencil scrawl, "Abductor of Peace." The words made no sense, and too much sense at once. Boyd, seeing his own notice flap in another man's hand like a toy, felt fury drain him of the last of his excuses. He went inside and took his coat from its peg and told no one where he was going. Boone's men shifted their weight like a school of fish, the mass deciding something in small increments. A group on the far ridge peeled away, and the dust rose behind them in two braided strands. Chaska's men saw and did not move, which was how a hunter watches, not a soldier. Somewhere, quietly, someone made a decision Boone had not ordered. A man went out wide with his hat pulled low, and his chin tucked the way a head will tuck when a neck knows where a bullet will likely look for it. He rode not toward the valley mouth, but toward the little draw Evelyn and Chaska had come through. Men can be smart about land they don't love if they are afraid enough of what waits, where the land ends. The old woman pressed a folded thing into Evelyn's palm. It was unremarkable, a small scrap of hide with pressed herbs stitched inside, but the stitching was tight and even, and the knot was a neat little head that told its own story about the hands that made it. "For strong breath," the old woman said. She mimed breathing. Evelyn nodded and tucked it into her dress with the other charm bag. It felt childish, and it felt like armor, and she let it be both. A shout rose from the ridge, not fear, not triumph, not yet. A scout's cry, short and sharp. Chaska answered with a hand signal, and a second later the boy's arrow went out from the shadow he had chosen and thudded into the bank at a horse's feet in the draw, where the ground sweated water, even on a dry day. The horse danced back, and then forward, and then back again, not wanting what its rider wanted. The rider cursed, and the curse bounced off the stones and came back sour to his own ears. The fire that had been far off came nearer on the wind, a sheet being dragged across grass, a whisper filling its belly. You can outrun a man who doesn't know the land. You cannot outrun a fire that finds its own roads. Boone smelled it and swore, because he had been thinking of heat as a friend that makes men run, and now it was a thing he would have to outthink as well as outshout. He wheeled his horse to find the line where he could own the day again. He pointed to the low ground where the river ran thin and brown, and he sent men there to hold it. But the river was too narrow to help, and too thick with mud to trust, and two horses went in and came out with a sound like soup, splattering on a stove. Chaska turned to Evelyn. "We go higher," he said. "Not away. Up." He gestured to where the valley's back wall stepped into shelves. Like a stair, the land had grown for itself. Evelyn nodded. Her legs trembled from standing still, which is a different kind of work than running. She moved anyway. The old woman barked 3 words, and the women lifted the little ones and the bundles that mattered, and moved with the same efficiency a group of experienced hands uses to clear a table before a fight breaks out. They climbed. The shelves cut the wind into pieces, and smoke pooled in the bowls, and then slid away again like a creature testing the edges of a cage. Evelyn put her palm against the stone as she climbed, and the stone's coolness steadied her in a way nothing soft could have. She did not look down, not because she was afraid of heights, but because she was afraid of seeing men she recognized at the bottom. Matthew, with his head bent, Dorsey's ring glinting, Boone's teeth. She kept her eyes on Chaska's heel. They reached a shelf that held a little room between 2 bulges of rock and slid into it. The world outside narrowed to a strip. Through the strip she could see Boone pointing again, sending 2 men to the left and 3 to the right, while he took the center for himself. He believed in the center. Men like him make a habit of being where the center looks like it will do the most damage to other people's plans. Chaska crouched and drew a map in the dust with the tip of his knife. Evelyn watched as if looking at a book written big enough for her to read. He showed where the fire would come, belly low, where the wind would tilt it, where the horses would shy, where the men would think there was a gap and find there was only a different kind of trouble. He tapped a place and looked at her. "If we move," he said, "we move to this, not this." He tapped the wrong place. It was a test to see if she would nod at the wrong thing, just to please him. She touched the right place without thinking, and his mouth softened the distance between suspicion and trust by a finger's width. Shots cracked again. One hit stone and sprayed chips that whispered past Evelyn's cheek. She put her hand there and came away with the tiniest bead of blood, bright as a red berry, and that blood made the baby inside her jump, startled awake, and she went perfectly still to let the jump subside, holding one breath long enough to feel it falter and then settle again, the way you hold a plank in a wind until your muscles find where the wind will always push and learn to wait there. Chaska noticed without looking. "Strong breath," he said, echoing the old woman, and for a second the words were big enough to stand in. When the sun hit the right angle, Boone tried charm again. He took off his hat and held it by the brim, like a man making a gentle statement about good faith. "You're men of sense," he called. "You give me what's mine, and we'll ride. You keep her, and this turns to noise you won't like, and maybe none of us does." He let the hat hang at his side, as if his grief at the day's ugliness had made his wrist too heavy to lift. The performance had worked on hungrier men. It did not work here. The proper drums answered him, not with anger, but with the kind of patience that says, "We will outlast," the way you like to measure time. On the ridge behind Boone, Matthew slid from his saddle and scrambled forward on hands and knees, trying to look like a man who had lost something rather than a man who had sold someone. He had packets under his shirt, papers he could not read, but knew mattered, deeds and side contracts, and a penciled list of cattle brands he had lifted from Boone's desk, while Dorsey relieved himself outside. He meant to get them to the sheriff. He meant to walk them right under Boyd's nose and knock the blindness out of him, with proof. He had thought proof would act like a hammer. He had not thought about nails. In town, Boyd saddled up anyway, proofs or no proofs. He left the notice board bare, where the bounty had been, and the hole the tack had left looked like an eye you did not want to look at too long. He told Jonah, "Keep the street if I don't." Jonah did not ask what that meant. He had seen enough men tell him to do things and die anyway. He dipped his pen and wrote a line at the bottom of a page. Not a name, not yet. The number of empty boxes he had drawn on the previous page, counting spaces waiting for truths. Not yet here. He put the book away with a neat clap. He washed his hands. He did not expect it would keep them clean. Afternoon thinned. The fire grew a new vocabulary. It learned to leap. It put tongues up to taste the wind. Boone made his men dampen blankets and beat at the little snakes of flame that ran through last year's grass. But the snakes multiplied when beaten. Chaska shifted his people sideways across the shelves, guiding them like a man moving pieces on a board he had built himself. Evelyn followed with the old woman's palm sometimes warm on her shoulder, steadying her when the stone tilted. A rider came down with a white cloth on a stick. Parley. Chaska nodded once. He could have refused, but refusals can be their own traps. He walked into the open where the shelf widened. Evelyn felt her throat close, because the open made him a target, and she did not yet trust the day not to take him from the story with the same neatness a book takes a character when the chapter ends. The rider with the white cloth looked around with his head stiff, like a chicken brought to a new yard. He had a pinch of acne scars by his jaw and an old scar on his knuckles where teeth had met skin a long time ago. "Boone says a talk," he said. His voice wanted to be bored and failed. Chaska said nothing. He lifted his chin. The rider swallowed and cleared his throat and tried again. "You give the girl," he said. "He says there's money for your trouble." He seemed to be reciting from something he could see inside his eyes. Chaska turned and looked back at Evelyn, not to ask, but to witness. She shook her head once. The rider saw it. His eyes flicked. He saw her belly, too. Men see different things depending on what someone has told them to look for. He saw trouble and did not want to own the seeing. "There's no girl," Chaska said in English. The words like 3 stones dropped in a row into a creek. The rider's mouth opened and closed. He looked back at Boone, as if hoping for a signal that would make the problem rename itself. Boone's face did not move. "Talk's over," Chaska said. He walked back into the shelf's shadow, and the rider snatched the white cloth up, as if it might save him from bullets. It would not. Evening slid its blue shirt over the day. The wind sat down and caught its breath, and in the still air the fire's smolder showed its teeth. Evelyn felt the heat on her face, and thought of the barn's lanterns, and the Reverend's scratching pen. She heard in her head the words from the outline of her life that had been handed to her by other people: daughter, sister, bride, property. She pressed her palm into the rock so hard, a small starburst of pain went up her arm, like light through a bottle. She said out loud, soft enough only the rock would hear, "Evelyn, mother." The word felt like a thing you have to steal back from a thief who thinks it's his, because his pocket held it for 10 minutes. Wind rose again, with new smells folded into it. Damp earth where men had dug at the riverbanks, sharp pine resin where someone had cracked a branch, horse stink so strong it outshouted sweat. A shape moved in the strip of world between rocks, and then another. Chaska's hand lifted. Evelyn did not know what each finger meant, but she knew the men around him did. They vanished from their places and reappeared where she had not known there were places to be. Men on Boone's side slid down toward the valley floor in a crab's awkward scrabble. They tried to carry quiet with them, and failed. A gun clicked, and the sound hopped from stone to stone and made more noise than the shot that followed, which was mostly swallowed by smoke. The first outlaw reached the shelf below Evelyn's and put a hand to pull himself up to where air could be stolen from her mouth. He looked up and saw not her, but the old woman waiting for him, with a spear of wood sharpened to a point, like a knitting needle for mending giants' clothes. He hesitated because she was small and old, and in that hesitation, the spear went in. It went in with more surprise than force. He yelled, and his yell went sour when he slid back, and the rock took skin off his forearms like bark off a sapling. The old woman grunted as if she had lifted something heavy and set it down, and then she spat. The spit neat, the gesture an old prayer. Boone misread the shelf fight as weakness on the camp's part, and pushed down hard. He took 2 men and went faster than was wise. His hat went from his head, and he did not notice. Without the hat, he looked older all at once, the scalp showing under hair that had covered more a year ago. He had taken bad care of his nerves, and it showed in the skin at his temples. He wanted it done. He wanted to ride through with the girl on a rope, and the men with the drums quiet. and the woman who had stabbed one of his boys with a stick punished in a way that would tell the story right when it went back to town. He wanted the world to be simple. It refused. On the far side, a shot from the ridge where Matthew crawled went wide and hit dust. An embarrassing failure. Matthew swore under his breath and felt his body shake with a useless flood of energy that had nowhere good to go. He pulled up, steadied, took a second shot at a hat in the distance, and the hat jumped. The man under it kept riding. Matthew didn't know if he was grateful or not that he had only scalped a hat. He checked the packets under his shirt and started to move on, belly low, thinking of Boyd and the office and the empty nail on the notice board. Boyd, riding hard now, saw the first flickers of fire as he took the long bend that kept the wind at his back and his sense of what was right in front of him. He thumbed his beard and tasted ash and thought of the time the courthouse steps had caught from a dropped cigar and how fast men had run, throwing buckets and curses. This wasn't a step. This was the whole page. Evelyn's legs went jelly and then wood and then jelly again, and somewhere in that cycling, she discovered she could still decide which way to put her foot. The old woman told her, breathe through the fire's belly. And at first Evelyn did not know what that meant, and then she did. Take shallow breaths when the smoke pools, deeper when it slides, and never give the fire all your air at once. Chaska heard something, a little clicking sound like seed pods, snapping in heat, and he folded Evelyn into the narrowest part of shade for a moment and stepped out again to look toward the ridge. He stiffened, a figure there, small, bent wrong, held up by rage more than bone, waved something long and thin and wrong, and the wrongness made the hair at the back of his neck lift before his mind said the word. Scalp. The figure's laugh slid down the slope with the scalp's hair streaming from his fist. He turned a little to show his face to Boone, and the light caught it, and the line of his mouth was Dorsey's. Evelyn couldn't see that far, not well enough to make it human, only shape and motion and a floating piece of herself that might be or might not be, and she told herself that ribbons can be bought, 2 to a penny. Chaska did not tell her the color yet. The old woman did not either. Some mercies require a second's planning. Before that second passed, a fresh clatter of hooves rolled down the draw, and a man from Boone's own line flung himself into the camp's outer ring with his hands up. He shouted in the thick, stumbling voice of a drunk who had sobered fast enough to hurt. "Fire's gonna eat us if we keep this up," he bawled. "He'll ride out and leave whoever can't sit a horse to cook." He pointed back at Boone, without naming him, and looked like a dog that had left one pack and asked to be led into another. Chaska nodded, and one of his men took the outlaw's gun and sent him into the far shade, not as mercy, but as economy. The man's fear smelled like piss in the heat. He sank down and covered his face, and his shoulders shook because he had come right up to the edge of being ash and had backed away too fast to hide the shaking. Boone saw the defection and roared, anger flaying his voice down to tendons. He punched his horse in the neck, and the animal tossed its head and slewed and almost spilled him, and he yanked it straight and bit his lip and tasted his own blood and liked the taste because it gave him a jolt of something that felt like a truth. He could still hurt things. He jerked his chin at Dorsey. Dorsey waved the scalp again. The ribbon curled and riffled. It was red. Evelyn's ribbon had been red. Lots of girls liked red. The thought did not comfort her. It left splinters. Reverend Pike, who had walked out beyond his courage and found himself in the low stretch of road between town and the river, held his register under his arm, as if the book could pull him into a decentness he had not been able to hold on to by himself. He came over a rise and saw Boyd's horse, and lifted a hand, and Boyd reined in, and they looked at each other like men who had shared a secret badly. "You can't go out there," Boyd said. "I can't keep records from under a bed," the Reverend said. He tried to smile and ended by grimacing. "You going to make it right, Harlan?" Boyd shifted. "I'm going to stop it from being worse," he said, and he believed it for just long enough to kick his horse and go on. The Reverend followed, because when a man's made you ashamed, it sometimes feels right to make him uncomfortable with your faith after. They reached the low ground where the river braided like hair, You cannot keep neat. Smoke lay like a sullen dog. Voices carried. The book under the Reverend's arm felt suddenly heavy, as if it had learned the weight of what it had swallowed. He thought of pushing it into Boyd's hands and letting him carry the sin the rest of the way. But he knew the sin didn't lighten that way. He thought of tearing the page out with Boone's name on it, but paper tears loud in a quiet, with guns in it, and also a torn page is only a page that learned to hide. He thought of the thin line he had drawn over the names and the way the oil in the ink made it shine if you looked sideways. He set his jaw as if he were about to pull a tooth and took a step toward the ridge where he could lift the book and let men see there was a word other than Boone's in the air. Widow Lark, who had walked farther than she had a right to, like the Reverend, turned up on the same stretch of ground from an angle no one watched, because nobody expected anything useful to come from that angle. She had brought her old marriage certificate with her and a sash of faded ribbon in her pocket, not because she believed in talismans, but because holding something that had held in another wind steadied her in this one. She heard the laughter from the ridge and she stopped and looked, old eyes squinting, and saw the red ripple. "Storm Bride," she whispered to the cottonwoods, angry at the words now for being right so often when you wanted them to be wrong. The drums held. The smoke thickened. The river made mud with a worked sigh. Evelyn felt heat lick her cheek, and the baby kicked so high under her ribs she gasped. Chaska's hand went half out, and then he let it fall, not from reluctance, but because the old woman gave him a look that said, "Let her stand her own body." He obeyed. Men who live long learn to take instruction where it's offered. A scout slid in, belly and chest and chin slick with sweat and ash, and he whispered in Chaska's ear, and Chaska's eyes narrowed to knife slits. He gestured and the scout panted out the rest, and pointed at the place where the draw pinched into a crease a man could step over in spring and break his leg in summer. Men were trying that crease now out of panic or ignorance. Panic and ignorance are cousins, and when they travel together, they pull a lot of houses down. Chaska nodded. He gestured to Evelyn and mimed a move that would take her to a crevice he had kept for a last thing. She shook her head and touched the old woman's arm. "Together," she said, and the old woman snorted approvingly. Chaska's mouth did that small softening again, and then hardened. He had no time to be pleased with anything today. From the ridge, Dorsey whooped and tossed the scalp higher, like a boy showing off a ball. It flashed in the sun. The red ribbon flared. He turned and presented it to Boone with a flourish. Boone held up a hand and smiled the smile that means a man believes a story has bent back toward him. He took the scalp. He lifted it, showed it like a trophy to the men behind, a promise of ending. "She's done," he shouted to the smoke. "She's in the book the way I say she is." The words echoed stupidly off stone. He liked their sound too much to notice they didn't carry. Down on the shelf, Evelyn's fingernails bit her palm deep enough to leave crescents she'd have to explain later to herself. Chaska looked at the ribbon and then at Evelyn, and his face did not change at all. She could not tell if that meant mercy or certainty, and for 3 breaths, that ignorance felt like a blanket pulled over her head. Matthew, crawling, saw Dorsey show the scalp and thought at first he would vomit up the little soft part of his courage he had just started to shape. Then he saw the edge where hair had been cut jagged, with a knife not sharpened for such work, and he thought of the girls in town who tied ribbons in their hair and rolled their plaits up in summer. He thought, too, of Boone's office and the string of trophies Boone had kept, like a boy's cruel collection of beetles, dried and pinned. Dorsey was the sort to fake what he needed, if it would crank the day the way he wanted. Matthew did not know if this gave him hope or something worse. He kept moving. He had the papers. He had to turn them into a weight that could tip Boyd. Boyd reached the lower ridge and saw the camp on the shelves and the lines of Boone's men, and a part of him that loved order said, "This is nothing I can mend with a word." Another part, the one that hated seeing his own scribble flapped on a stick like a child's toy, said, "Take something from Boone, something he thinks is his." He slid down and took cover. He found his breath. He picked his shot. He didn't shoot. He lifted his head and shouted, "Boone, I'll read you your own list if you want the town to hear it." It was a foolish, brave line, and it made 3 heads turn, one of them Boone's. Boone snarled. "You'll read nothing," he said, though his voice wasn't built for range. "You'll write my words where I tell you to." Boyd laughed, and the laugh surprised him with how good it felt. "I think your words write themselves now," he said, and the smoke swallowed half of it and carried the other half someplace. It might do good. Chaska saw the moment and pushed his people sideways again. One more shelf, one more angle. The fire would not take, in a rush. The old woman guided Evelyn's elbow, and they slid into a sliver where cool air fanned for a precious half-minute. Evelyn swallowed it and felt dizzy with gratitude. "Stormbride," the old woman said, quieter than before. "Stormbride carries storms both ways." Evelyn didn't know yet which way hers would go. She only knew that the scalp waving on the ridge had the right color ribbon, and that the child inside her was alive enough to kick, and that a man who had not saved her at dusk had opened his tipi and called her by her own name, and that all those things together made a braid strong enough to hold her weight another hour. On the ridge, Dorsey came down the slope toward Boone, with the scalp held higher, theatrical as a preacher's gesture, and tripped on a root he should have seen. He stumbled and snatched himself straight with a laugh. The scalp slid on the breeze, and the ribbon's knot flashed, the way a girl's clumsy knot flashes when she ties it herself, because her mother's hands are busy. Boone reached and caught it, and held it up, and roared his victory to the smoke and the hills and the little river that smelled like pennies. The men behind him cheered, because cheering feels better than wondering if you are wrong. And in the shelf shadow below, Chaska turned to Evelyn with the kind of care a man uses to hold a small bird that will die if you squeeze it or if you do not, and he said, in a voice that gave her the answer and the cost, in one breath, "The ribbon is yours, the scalp is not." The old woman exhaled hard enough to click her tongue against her teeth, a sound half anger and half relief. Evelyn's knees went weak, and then stiff, and then weak again, and she put her hand on the rock until the skin hurt enough to keep her from slipping into that sweet, awful place where grief lets you lie down. She did not weep. There would be time for that, or there wouldn't. The baby turned, with a rolling seasick motion, a slow living thing, and Evelyn steadied. "We make the story," the old woman said, as if answering something not asked. Not his book. The word book made Evelyn think of the Reverend again, the way his pen had drawn that thin, doubtful line. Doubt could be a blade or a balm. Today, it was a small blade she could tuck up her sleeve. Boone, scalp in fist, lifted it for a rider who had just come in from the south, a man with a brim pulled low and a coat too fine for this kind of dust. He showed his prize like a receipt. The rider lifted his chin. "Sheriff's seen your bounty pinned on a stick," the rider said. "He's coming to collect the whole debt." Boone grinned. "I keep the ledger," he said. "I pay what I call it." The word ledger skittered down to where Jonah Pike stood in his back room, thinking he should have locked the door, and then thinking that a locked door is only an invitation to break the jam. He wrote another small box, not a name, and then, because he was a practical man who hated superstition but knew men needed hooks, he wrote in the margin, "Stormbride, unknown." He had no right to the name. He took it anyway in pencil, where it could be erased when the truth came. Evening thickened. The fire's front pricked like a comb. Boone gestured wide, calling his men to a line that would sweep. Chaska put his hand on Evelyn's shoulder and took it off and gave it back to the old woman and stepped forward into the open again. Evelyn followed him with her eyes and then with her body to the lip of the shelf. The world below looked like a map again, and the map had a new mark on it now, a moving, waving wrongness with a red tongue. Dorsey lifted the scalp a last time, and then, with a flourish that told everyone watching, he believed the day belonged to him again, tossed it down toward the shelf as if giving a gift that would land like a curse. It fell end over end, hair and ribbon twisting. It brushed a rock and hung a breath in the air, and, Evelyn's eye caught the ribbon's knot, and knew it as a woman knows her own handwriting. She felt nothing and everything. The scalp slapped the shelf below and lay with the hair spread like a fan. Chaska did not look at it. He looked at Boone. Boone smiled thin and slow. "You see?" he called, his voice greased with triumph. "The land keeps what I tell it to keep." His men laughed, short, barking, wanting the moment to harden into something they wouldn't have to reevaluate later in the quiet of a bunk. In the crease beyond the shelf, a whistle sounded, sharp, urgent, a warning from a boy who had seen men trying the pinch again. Chaska's head snapped. The old woman's hand tightened on Evelyn's wrist hard enough to bruise. Evelyn felt the bruise and was grateful for it, because it told her she was still in a body, not just a name in a book, crossed once in doubt, and then again, in black. She closed her eyes for one heartbeat. She opened them. Fire breathed in, ready to speak new words in a faster tongue. Up on the ridge, Boone lifted his hand to signal the sweep that would force the camp against heat and stone. Dorsey, grinning, wiped his palm on his pants and reached for his gun. The red ribbon lay below, like a thread leading into a labyrinth. For the first time since dusk, sheriff and outlaw and preacher and brother and undertaker's son and widow and warrior held the same breath at once, and the breath tasted of ash and iron and something older than either. Promise that breaks and promise that holds. The next sound was a horn, thin and far. Not cavalry, not church, an old warning, lifted by someone who remembered it the right way. It made the horses' ears flick and men's hands pause, and the fire hesitate, as if listening to see if it were meant for it too. Dorsey's grin faltered. Boone's hand hung in the air, unspent. The scalp with the red ribbon lay like a lie that had not yet learned how to hold itself upright when stared at too long. Chaska's eyes, flat and steady, stayed on Boone's. The old woman's breath sawed in Evelyn's ear like a file. Widow Lark's lips moved in a prayer that used no words anyone in the valley still shared. Reverend Pike steadied his book like a shield, and from the shadow on Boone's left, a man stepped forward with something rolled in his fist. Paper, smudged, bearing Boone's own mark, and called out, voice raw and ready to burn bridges, or be burned on them. "I've brought the sheriff the proof of what you stole." Boone turned, slow as a door swollen with heat. Matthew lifted the papers higher, and Dorsey, eyes narrowing, reached to knock him down, like a bad idea. Before the reach finished, a small, tight bundle came tumbling from Dorsey's belt when he moved, the thing he'd used to fake the scalp's base, if anyone looked close. It hit a rock and cracked open like a dry gourd. What spilled wasn't skin. It was horsehair, stitched to a thin ring of rawhide, smeared with butcher's blood gone tacky in the heat. The red ribbon slithered off like a snake shedding a skin that never fit. For a breath, the valley forgot the fire. The valley forgot the fire for a breath, and then the world remembered everything at once. Dorsey cursed and snatched for his belt, as if he could push the spilled lie back into its skin. But lies do not let themselves be repacked when too many eyes watch. Boone's stare slid from the horsehair ring to Matthew's fistful of papers and back, the muscles in his jaw jumping like fish in a net. The men behind him saw the ribbon for what it was. Their cheer died in their throats and turned into something sour they would later call smoke. Chaska did not waste the breath the valley had taken. He lifted his hand, and his people shifted as one organism, opening a notch in the shelf so the women and children could move, while the men stayed still enough to make the stillness look like stone. Evelyn felt the old woman's fingers press her wrist in a pattern that meant wait, and then go, and then wait again. She realized her body had learned new orders in a single day. Boone moved first, because men who live by moving first do not know how to do anything else when the world refuses to hold still for them. He fired at Matthew. The shot cut a line of light across the smoke and smacked rock. Matthew flinched and flattened, the papers crumpling in his fist. Dorsey fired at the crumple and hit air. Sheriff Boyd fired at Dorsey and knocked his hat into dust, where it skittered like a spooked animal. And for a heartbeat, Dorsey's bare head made him look smaller, more boy than bully. Then he bared his teeth and the boy vanished again. The fire came back into the day with a roar like a crowd. It licked the edges of the valley and climbed the creek bed in little tongues that ate faster than anything with teeth. Smoke thickened and turned the men's shouts into muffled orders from a dream. Reverend Pike, sweating under the weight of the register, ducked behind a cutbank with Boyd and pressed his spine to damp clay. "You bring the book to a gunfight," Boyd said, half laughing because men laugh when there is not a decent prayer they can say with a straight face. "I brought a word that should have been said first," the Reverend answered, and lifted the cover just enough to see that the thin, doubtful line he had drawn still lay there like a nerve. "If it will save one life, I will hold it up like a lantern." Boone pointed and 3 men raked shots along the shelf. Rocks spat, and one flake cut Evelyn's cheek again. She tasted salt and iron, and kept her breathing steady the way the old woman had taught. Through the fire's belly, Chaska moved low and smooth, a line drawn by a practiced hand, and took a position where his shadow disappeared into a seam, and only his eyes remained to keep count of the day's arithmetic. He counted Boone's men. He counted his. He counted the small bodies tucked in, folds of hide behind him, and the old woman's breath, and the one breath inside Evelyn's body that was not hers. When he had his numbers, he made a plan that did not depend on the sheriff's courage or Boone's shame. Plans that depend on other men's better angels burn fast. Matthew crawled to Boyd, papers still in his fist, one elbow torn where the rock had rasped it raw. "He's stolen water that wasn't his," he gasped. "He's had men mark calves not theirs. He's written deeds on top of deeds until the land can't tell who holds it." He shoved the papers into Boyd's vest. "You wanted proof. Read." Boyd slid his eyes over the lines and saw enough to feel something levered loose inside him that had been wedged there a long time. "It'll do," he said, and Matthew's mouth twisted. "I don't want it to do," Matthew said. "I want it to undo." Another shot cracked, and Matthew's head snapped up, as if the sound had tugged a string in his neck. "My sister," he said through his teeth, and Boyd understood that for some men, the ledger only matters because there is a name you want kept out of it. Dorsey, stung by Boyd's shot, and by his own spilling shame, went down the slope like a man who meant to break something with his body, if the bullet would not do it. He aimed for the notch the Lakota had opened, the place where the women moved. The boy with the strong bow loosed, and Dorsey swatted the arrow away with the same backhand he used on dogs that begged. He hit the shelf, scrambled up on a burst of bad luck and nerve, and came face to face with Evelyn. He laughed, and then stopped laughing, because her knife was in her hand, and her eyes were not a woman's eyes from a barn. They were the eyes of someone who had learned in one night what some men never learn in a lifetime, that there are moments when standing is a kind of attack. "Come quietly, girl," he said for Boone to hear. Evelyn moved the knife a little so the light caught the edge. "No," she said. Dorsey reached. The old woman took him in the thigh with her spear of wood, quick and efficient, and he flinched and shot wild, and the shot went into rock and spat chips into his own cheek. He swore and backhanded the old woman. Evelyn stepped in the space his slap made and drove the knife up to the hilt under his ribs, the way her father had taught her to mend harness. One firm stroke, no dithering, eyes on the point. Dorsey made a sound like a man who has had a lie slapped out of his mouth. He fell sideways and slid, heels drumming. His gun fired once into the air, and the noise called 2 more shots by instinct from men who couldn't see where they were sending bullets anymore. Boone saw Dorsey fall, and something mean and childish twisted his face. He shot at Evelyn, missed, shot again, and would have found her, but Chaska moved like a shadow, deciding to be a man, and put himself where the bullet wanted to go. The shot took him in the side, low, the kind that makes a sound in flesh everyone recognizes and no one wants to claim. He did not fall. He absorbed it, let the pain pass through him and out the other side like smoke, and said one word, "Up." The old woman pushed Evelyn into the notch behind the shelf, and then shoved Chaska's shoulder, and he took the shove with the grace of a man who has learned that letting someone help you can be a kind of leadership. The fire pressed its face to the shelf's lip and breathed hot. Men coughed, horses squealed, and tried to turn where there was nowhere to turn. Boone, recognizing a threat he could not command, barked orders that made sense only if you stood where he stood. Half his men couldn't hear him. The other half disagreed with his plan and obeyed anyway, because they were not practiced at choosing. Sheriff Boyd, papers in his vest, lifted himself enough to shout again, this time not at Boone, but to his own men on the far ridge, who had followed at his back and were belly flat now, with their hats off. "Push them to the river," he yelled. "Don't push them to the fire." His men, who had thought this would be a simple day of telling men who already knew better to stop, had enough training to understand. They squeezed their line. They pressed Boone's riders toward the brown thread of water that had been a ribbon in a pretty story and was now a hazard. The river had its own idea. In the dry months, it left behind pockets that looked firm until a hoof broke the skin and the ground swallowed what it had been pretending to hold up. One of Boone's men found such a pocket and went into the knee and yanked and went into the hock and yanked again and lost the horse, which burst free and galloped blind while he went down with the slow, syrupy insistence of quicksand. He screamed and then got careful, because a man drowning in sand discovers what he should have remembered from boyhood. Stillness buys breath. He didn't stay still long enough. Panic and ignorance, those cousins, put their arms around him and danced. Boone kicked his horse to the river because moving felt like victory, and the horse balked at the smell of rot. The mud breathed. Boone forced it. It slid. It went in, up to the chest in a spill of brown that sounded obscene, and Boone yanked at the reins and cursed and slapped, and the horse's whites showed. It heaved and got one leg up and then the other, and Boone laughed and threw his head back, and in that instant the ground reached up and took the horse again from another angle, a slyer pocket, and the animal sank to the breastbone and would not rise. Boone spat and leaped off and landed on a patch that held and shouted for a rope, and a rope came, and a man threw the end with a prayer that had not been said lately, and Boone missed the catch, and the rope slapped mud and was sucked in like a snake into a gopher hole. Boyd saw it, and his mouth made a grim line, because he knew where quicksand pooled along that bend. He had warned children away from it with a gentle foot and an easy story. He had never seen a grown man in it who deserved it this much. Chaska's blood ran hot off his side and cooled on his hip, and he pressed his palm there and kept moving, because men do not stop while other men are aiming. He guided Evelyn and the old woman up one more shelf to where smoke thinned and wind found them. Evelyn saw the river below and Boone's flounder, and something cold and instructive entered her. "It wants him," she said without a smile. "He wants to be wanted," the old woman replied. "It is a marriage if he keeps fighting." The word marriage made Evelyn's stomach turn once, not with sickness, but with anger so clean it felt like water. Reverend Pike chose that moment to stand, because the old cowardice in him could not bear to sit while men died, believing a lie he had put in ink. He lifted the register over his head, and it shook like a lantern in a wind. "Silas Boone," he called, and his voice surprised him with its reach. Heads turned toward the preacher, the way heads turn toward a bell. "Your vow is void. It was forced. It is struck in doubt." He held the page up. The thin line over the entry caught the light like the back of a snake. "Before God and man," he said, voice cracking, "before the ledger of any honest town, I declare it void." He did not say the name beneath the line. He would not hand Evelyn to them again. Boone heard none of the sense and all of the challenge. He snarled and raised his pistol and fired at the white blur of book and sleeve. The shot tore the corner of the register and took the Reverend in the shoulder. He staggered but did not drop the book. He lowered it to his chest like a man hugging a child he had no right to. "It is void," he said again, softer, to his own blood, and sat down with his back to the bank and shut his eyes, not from cowardice, but because some prayers require darkness to find their shape. Matthew howled, not a word, not a curse, when the Reverend fell. He sprang up without the slow sense that had kept him alive through the last hour. He ran along the bank with the papers in his fist, shouting at Boone that it was over, that the land was in the sheriff's keeping now, that the names would be set right. Boone swung his pistol and fired, and missed because the mud sucked at his stance, and the smoke stung his eyes. But he steadied and fired again, and Matthew jerked, as if a rope had been yanked through him hard. He stumbled and kept coming, and stumbled again, each step a betrayal of his body by his will. And then he was at the edge of the river, and the ground gave way and took him by the ankles. He looked up, surprised like a boy, and met Evelyn's gaze high on the shelf. She shook her head, once the way she had at the parley. He laughed a tiny laugh, the first decent sound he'd made in a year, and pressed the papers against his own chest with both hands, as if his heart were a table he could steady. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words traveled clean through the rising heat. Boyd scrambled down and grabbed Matthew under the arms. The mud sucked at Matthew's legs and made the same wet, greedy sound it had made for the outlaw's horse. "Hold," Boyd said, the word a command to every muscle in Matthew and in himself and in the sucking ground. Matthew obeyed for 3 breaths. Then his body remembered gravity and let go. The papers tore from his hands, and one skated free on a lucky slab of driftweed that held enough to slide it toward the bank, and Boyd snatched it and shoved it into his vest with the others, and pulled, and cursed, and pulled, until the mud let go. With a belch of defeat, Matthew sprawled on the bank like something born too fast. His eyes filmed. He looked at Boyd and then past him to Evelyn, and shaped a word with his mouth that could have been her name, or could have been a prayer. He stopped in the middle of it, and the shape held as if the word might still climb into it later, if someone called it right. Boone saw the sheriff with the papers, and saw Matthew's slack face, and knew a kind of fear he did not recognize from younger days. It had numbers in it. It counted. He thrashed toward firmer ground, and found none. The mud climbed his boots and then his shins, and each jerk set him lower. He tried to roll onto the old roots at the edge, and reached for a cottonwood snag that went soft in his hands, and broke like stale bread. Boyd aimed, and then lowered the gun. "You don't shoot a man a river has already sentenced." "Silas," he called, voice flat. "Leave off. Lie still. You might breathe long enough to think of a decent last word." Boone spat brown, and laughed, and then choked. "I write the words," he said hoarse. "I write." He went down to the thighs. He pulled, and the pulling settled him to the belly. He howled at his men, and they made a show of moving before the fire showed them a better theater. "A rope," he begged finally, and the begging sat on him like a bad jacket he would have cut off if he could. "A hand." None went. Men can watch a man like that, if he has made them carry too much of him for too long. The old woman beside Evelyn made a soft sound in her throat that might have been pity and might have been indigestion. "He is marrying the mud," she said. "He made vows to take, and the land takes him true." The fire tipped into the river from the far bank, and hissed, and leapt black smoke, and then pulled back, offended. It rolled around to search for grass where it could speak in tongues again. The drums on the shelf slowed to a heartbeat. Chaska's hand, pressed to his side, came away darker each time. He sat with his back to the rock and looked at Evelyn without apology for the way his breath shortened between words. "Storm bride," he said, a little smile pulling the corner of his mouth. "You brought a storm that did not kill us." Evelyn knelt and tore her dress, where it would not shame her, and folded the cloth, and pressed it to his wound, and he hissed, and let her. The old woman pressed another charm bag into his palm, and he closed his fingers around it, docile as a child. "You have done all you should have done," the old woman told him in Lakota, and he shook his head once. "Not all," he said. His gaze went to Evelyn's belly, and then to the smoke where the sky waited, patient as a ledger. Boone thrashed and begged and cursed, and promised, and sank, and did not understand that the ground did not care what he said. He got one hand on a root, and the root came loose with a soft, obscene sigh, like an old man giving up his last small pride. The mud climbed to his chest, He tipped his head back, and the tendons in his throat stood like cables. "Pike," he croaked, seeing the white blur of the Reverend's sleeve. "You write me out." The Reverend blinked sweat and blood into his eyes and said very clearly, "Silas Boone, I cannot write you where you have chosen to go." Boone spat again, and the spit puddled on his lip, because the mud held his chin too tight for gravity to work. "Sheriff," he tried. Boyd did not move. "You put my words in your vest," Boone said, panic turning him honest. "You give them back." Boyd patted his vest like a man checking a keepsake and did not answer. The mud took Boone to the throat, then to the mouth. He tilted for air, and the tilt settled him to the nose. For a breath he made a strange, delicate sound, like a man blowing a candle without wishing. Then the river made him its ground, and the ground made him its story, and there was no more Silas Boone in the daylight, only light moving on brown water, where something below shifted a last time and went still. The men who had come for pay looked at one another, and at the fire, and at the shelves, and at the sheriff's vest, and decided, each in his own small court, that the day owed them nothing more. Some rode away without looking back. Some threw their guns aside first, as if to say the metal had betrayed them. One stooped and picked up Dorsey's fallen hat and threw it into the quicksand. A small, dangerous joke you do, only when you are sure the joke's target cannot answer. On the shelf, the boy with the strong bow let the string ease and rubbed his fingers where the cord had bit them raw. The drums were quiet. The wind smelled of wet ash and pennies and wild mint where Evelyn had crushed the old woman's sachet in her pocket with her fist. Sheriff Boyd climbed to the shelf with a grunt and knelt by Chaska. He looked at the wound and knew the rules of such wounds. He took off his vest and pushed the papers into the Reverend's lap and said, "Guard them." And the Reverend smiled with one corner of his mouth and said, "I will hold them so hard my bones will ache." Widow Lark came up the long way, leaning on her cane, and put her thin hand on Evelyn's hair and smoothed it into a shape that mothers make without thinking. She had tears on her face, and dust stuck to the wet and made a map of veined rivers. "Storm bride," she murmured, the words a blessing again, not a warning. "You brought a storm that fed us and washed a rotten thing away." Evelyn put her forehead to the old woman's knee and breathed, and felt something in her back loosen that had been knotted since the barn. Night came with a tired sigh and lay down on the day. Coyotes sang a cautious song to see who had survived. The fire worked itself into black lace on the ground and went to sleep where it could. In the teepee, under a moon that hid herself until the worst was over, Evelyn's labor took her like a patient friend who had been waiting in the corner with a coat over his arm. The old woman and two others worked the way women do when they trust their hands more than anyone's advice. Chaska lay on a pallet by the door, where the air was coolest, and watched the shadow of the lodge poles move. He listened to Evelyn's breaths and counted them. He tapped a small rhythm on the hide floor to give them a beat. He felt the charm bag under his fingers and remembered the way his wife had laughed before the soldiers brought winter to her camp in summer. He smiled at the memory and did not pull it tighter when it wanted to go. Reverend Pike sat outside the teepee with his register open on his knees, the torn corner flapping like a bird's tired wing. He had bandaged his shoulder with a strip of shirt and Boyd's help. He held the pen, and he did not write a name. He wrote a line. He drew it with care, the way a man draws his last decent breath. He made the line neat, and he made it thin, and he laid it over the forced entry with a tenderness that surprised him. "Void," he whispered to the ink. "Void," and set aside. He turned the page and found a space and wrote in clean script, "Burial. Dorsey, no family present. Burial unknown. Writer found on West Bank. Likely Boone's. Burial. None for Storm Bride. Living." He paused and looked up at the stars and remembered the coroner's face. How it would look one day, both kind and curious. He closed the book and put his hand on it like a man settling a child for sleep. Jonah Pike, in his back room, made his ledger serve as a thin, quiet church. He wrote neat lines and left boxes where he did not know the names, and wrote notes where his father would have chided him for clutter. In the margin, in letters so small you would miss them, if you were not looking to love something left out, he wrote. Storm bride, struck through. He did not know why he struck it. He only knew that some names needed a bar over them to remind the living not to use them in vain. Before dawn, Evelyn's child came with a wet cry, and a soft, outraged fist, and a good, angry kick, and the old women laughed and scolded, and set the tiny mouth to work. Evelyn lay back and stared at the roof and the shape the stars made when seen through. Smoke. She did not think of Boone. She did not think of the barn. She thought of her father's wagon inventory, and how he had written flour and salt and strap and whetstone in the same neat hand. He had written her name, the day she was born, in a Bible that now lacked its last pages. She thought, I will write this name somewhere the fire cannot eat. She turned her head and saw Chaska watching. His breaths came further apart now, like footsteps of a man whose path has lengthened, and gentle ground takes less of him at each step. She lifted the child and set him so that Chaska could see his own reflection in the slick black eyes. We'll call him for whatever name makes him strong, she said, and Chaska smiled and nodded and did not try to force a word on a child the land had yet to christen. He looked at the old woman, and she looked back and said what had to be said. You've guarded well, she told him. Go where your wife waits. He exhaled. His mouth softened into the shape of a man who has finally forgiven his legs for failing him once long ago when it would not have mattered anyway. Storm bride, he said to Evelyn, and his voice had the gratitude in it men save for water when they have been too proud to drink. He set his palm on the ground and thanked it, fingers curled as if holding a hand, and then he put his hand over his own chest and found the beat and counted it down like a drummer who knows when a song ends. When the counting stopped, the old woman reached and closed his eyes with 2 fingers and tied a small strip of red cloth in his braid, because he had died with a clean wish in his mouth, and men like that deserve a color. Sheriff Boyd dug more graves than he had come to dig. He put Boone's name nowhere. A stone could make it permanent. He put Dorsey in the earth with the same plainness. He would have given a better man, because a grave is not a ledger. It does not argue. He took the papers from his vest and wiped them clean of what blood he could, and rode them to a judge 2 towns over, who had not yet learned to like Boone's gold. He wrote a deposition that started with the phrase he had put on the notice, abductor of peace, and he crossed it out and wrote, in his careful blunt hand, accessory to the theft of water and land and breath. He signed his name the way men sign when they mean to look themselves in the face the next morning. Reverend Pike, when he had made his shoulders stop shouting for a little while, took his register and went to the river bend and held the book up to the light and then put it down and bent and took a handful of mud and smeared it over the thin line on the ugly entry and let it dry there. His own little plug of earth over a void, a ritual he invented, because no church he knew had an appropriate one. He smiled to think that heaven would have to invent one too, to keep up. Old Widow Lark came shy to the teepee with her marriage certificate in her pocket. She asked to hold the baby, and Evelyn placed the small weight in her arms without fear, because the old woman's hands had found steadiness again, now that the day had set. Widow Lark looked at the scrunched face and laughed once, surprised by joy. Storm boy, she said, I suppose that's a kind of luck. She untied the ribbon in her pocket, not the red one, a faded blue, and tied it to the edge of the cradle board the women had made, while Evelyn labored, their hands busy, because busy hands turn fear into blankets and milk. Take mine, she said. It's carried through more wind than you can want. Let it teach him to bend without breaking. Evelyn thanked her, and meant it, and tucked the end so it would not flap in any foolish way. They burned Chaska at dusk on a scaffold made with care. The men sang low, and the women's voices threaded through like smoke that chooses to rise rather than lie down. Evelyn stood with the child at her chest and let the sound press the ache both deeper and flatter. She promised nothing out loud. She had learned that promises said to the air can be stolen by men who keep strange ledgers. She made her promise in the pressure of her hand on the cradleboard and in the way she looked at the river, where it ran patient over the places that take and give. Boyd stood a little away with his hat off and did not make a speech. The Reverend muttered something that used to be a prayer and found it had changed in his mouth and let it be what it had become. Time passed in its stubborn way that does not care what you call a day on the page. Grass came back where fire had drawn its black lace. The river shifted its bed a hand's width. Men told the story with more noise than it needed in the saloon, and with less than it deserved in kitchens. And somewhere in every version, a scalp with a red ribbon leaked out of a pocket at the wrong moment and made men laugh harder than they had the right to. The judge's orders rippled through the county like a slow, sensible flood. Boone's papers came apart under fingers that had too long let such papers stand, like fences no one had checked. The deed to Evelyn's father's land, water, a little grass, found its way by Boyd's stubbornness and the judge's insistence back to a name that could hold it. Years later, Jonah Pike's undertaker's ledger shows a line you could miss if the light was wrong. He had turned a habit of plain speech into a style so careful it looked like love. There are names: Dorsey, no mourners, unknown, West Bank, likely Boone, 5 other men. Ashes gathered after prairie fire. On a page edge, faint, storm bride, struck through. Above it, in his neat hand, he wrote, "No burial, alive." The coroner's inquest recorded her name only once, and then struck it through in black ink. The paper with that black bar sits in a courthouse drawer that smells of old rain and glue. The parish register from Reverend Pike's hands still carries dried river mud across a line that tried to turn a human life into a transaction. Some days the mud flakes if you run your thumb over it. Most days it holds. Evelyn lives where grass sweetens when you crush it, and the wind talks in a tone that sounds less like orders and more like advice. She raises a boy who learns to place his feet in the shadows of roots and to breathe through heat and to call water by its right names. She carries a knife with a bone handle that she cleans with patience and never hides, not because she wants the world to fear her, but because she wants the world to know it must speak to her honestly. She keeps a small scrap of red ribbon in a tin at the back of a shelf. Not Boone's lie, not the scalp's shame, but a piece from a day before the barn, before the book. She unties it now and then, and ties it again to remember that some knots are worth making twice. Reverend Pike grows more careful with his pen. He writes fewer words and draws more lines where words try to do harm. Sheriff Boyd grows quieter and more particular. He learns which papers matter and which men. Widow Lark dies in her sleep one winter, with her marriage certificate under her pillow, a crease in the paper worn thin, where her thumb stroked the name she had kept when other things went to ash. Jonah Pike keeps his ledger straighter than his back will let him by the end, and when his son asks why a name is struck through, he says, "So you'll ask that question again when someone else tries to put a woman where she didn't put herself." Some nights the wind shifts, and you can smell the old fire, not sharp like new smoke, but low and sweet, like a story that chooses you and not the other way around. On those nights, if you stand by the river and listen to the mud breathe, you might hear a thin tone, like a horn, not cavalry, not church, the old warning for trouble. You can fight, and trouble you must outlast. If you listen longer, you may hear a drum. It is only your own heart, or it is the valley remembering how it sounded when it chose who to keep. And still, the parish register for that night is missing one name, the only one that mattered. If the ledger speaks again, you'll know which page to open first.